The fertile alluvium between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers witnessed humanity's first systematic attempt to understand the cosmos through divine narrative. Around 3500 BC, as Sumerian communities transitioned from scattered agricultural settlements to complex urban centers, their need to comprehend natural phenomena, social hierarchies, and existential questions gave birth to sophisticated mythological frameworks that would influence religious thought for millennia. The Sumerians established the foundational mythological corpus that subsequent Mesopotamian civilizations would inherit, adapt, and expand, a legacy that reaches into our modern world. Archaeological evidence from sites like Uruk and Eridu reveals that mythological concepts were already well established by 3200 BC. Clay tablets from this period contain fragmentary references to deities who would later become central figures in the classical Mesopotamian pantheon. The goddess Inanna appears in administrative records alongside grain distributions, indicating that divine figures were integrated into practical governance from the earliest urban periods. This wasn't mere superstition, it was the foundation of civilization itself. The Akkadian conquest around 2334 BC under Sargon of Akkad marked the first major transformation of Sumerian mythological traditions. The Akkadians, speaking a Semitic language, encountered the non-Semitic Sumerian culture and faced the challenge of integrating two distinct religious worldviews. Rather than wholesale replacement, they pursued systematic syncretism, identifying their deities with Sumerian counterparts while preserving core narrative structures. This process created fascinating linguistic and theological hybrids that would shape religious thought for thousands of years. The Babylonian period, beginning around 1894 BC with the Amorite dynasty, witnessed the most significant mythological developments. Under Hammurabi and his successors, Babylon emerged as the dominant political and cultural center, necessitating mythological narratives that legitimized Babylonian supremacy. The elevation of Marduk from a relatively minor local deity to supreme god of the pantheon exemplifies this process. The Enuma Elish, or Babylonian creation epic, represents the pinnacle of this mythological restructuring, composed during the Old Babylonian period but achieving its canonical form during the Neo-Babylonian era. Assyrian civilization, emerging as a major power around 1365 BC, inherited this rich mythological tradition but adapted it to reflect their militaristic culture and imperial ambitions. The Assyrians elevated Ashur, originally a local deity of their capital city, to supreme status while maintaining the broader Mesopotamian pantheon. Their royal inscriptions frequently invoke mythological precedents to justify military campaigns and territorial expansion. The preservation of these mythological traditions owes everything to the cuneiform writing system developed by the Sumerians around 3200 BC. The most significant archaeological discovery for understanding Mesopotamian mythology occurred at Nineveh, the last great Assyrian capital. Between 1849 and 1876, British archaeologists Austin Henry Layard and Hormuzd Rassam excavated the palace library of Ashurbanipal, the last great Assyrian king. This library, assembled around 650 BC, contained over 30,000 cuneiform tablets representing the most comprehensive collection of Mesopotamian literature ever assembled in antiquity. Among these tablets were multiple copies of the Epic of Gilgamesh, including the famous standard version compiled by the scholar-priest Sinlike Unini. The Ashurbanipal library also contained extensive mythological texts, including the Enuma Elish, the descent of Ishtar to the underworld, and numerous hymns and prayers addressing various deities. These texts reveal the systematic nature of Mesopotamian theological thought and the careful preservation of ancient traditions alongside contemporary innovations. Archaeological discoveries at other sites have supplemented the Nineveh finds, creating an unprecedented window into the ancient mind. But what shaped these stories? What forces of nature and geography molded the gods themselves? The geography of Mesopotamia profoundly influenced the development of mythological themes and narratives. The region's position between two major rivers created a unique environment that shaped religious imagination in distinctive ways. The annual flood cycles of the Tigris and Euphrates, while generally predictable, could vary dramatically in timing and intensity, creating both agricultural abundance and devastating destruction. These flood patterns directly influenced mythological concepts of cosmic order and chaos that would echo through every civilization that followed. Mesopotamian creation myths consistently feature primordial waters as the source of both life and destruction. Apsu, the freshwater ocean beneath the earth, and Tiamat, the saltwater sea, represent the fundamental forces from which all existence emerges. The tension between these waters reflects the real environmental challenges faced by Mesopotamian farmers who depended on controlled flooding for irrigation but feared uncontrolled inundation. The flat terrain of the Mesopotamian plain, broken only by artificial mounds marking ancient settlements, contributed to mythological concepts of vertical cosmic structure. The absence of natural mountains led to the construction of ziggurats, massive step towers that served as artificial sacred mountains connecting earth and heaven. These structures became focal points for mythological narratives about divine descent and human ascension. The scarcity of stone and timber in the alluvial plain influenced mythological descriptions of divine architecture. The gods were imagined as dwelling in structures made from precious materials unavailable to ordinary humans: gold, silver, lapis lazuli, and cedar wood imported from distant lands. The harsh summer climate, with temperatures exceeding 120 degrees and minimal rainfall, shaped mythological narratives about seasonal cycles and divine conflict. The myth of Inanna's descent to the underworld, which explains the barren summer months, directly reflects the environmental reality of Mesopotamian agriculture. The goddess's absence from the upper world corresponds to the period when agricultural activity ceases due to extreme heat and drought. Religious practices in Mesopotamia were inextricably linked to mythological narratives, with temple complexes serving as the primary venues for ritual reenactment of divine stories. The ziggurat complexes that dominated Mesopotamian cities were not merely architectural monuments, but functional religious institutions where mythological narratives were performed, recited, and reinterpreted. The Esagila temple complex in Babylon, dedicated to Marduk, exemplified this integration of mythology and religious practice. During the annual Akitu festival, priests would recite the complete Enuma Elish while performing ritual actions that reenacted Marduk's victory over Tiamat. The king played a central role in these ceremonies, symbolically taking on Marduk's attributes and renewing his divine mandate to rule. Similar practices occurred throughout Mesopotamia, with each major city maintaining its own cycle of festivals and rituals based on local mythological traditions. The Temple of Enlil at Nippur hosted ceremonies reenacting the god's role as divine administrator, while the Temple of Inanna at Uruk celebrated the goddess's powers of love and war through elaborate processions and ritual dramas. These religious practices served multiple functions beyond mere worship. They provided communal identity, reinforced social hierarchies, and offered explanatory frameworks for natural phenomena and human experiences. The development of mythological stories as explanatory narratives reflects the Mesopotamian approach to understanding causation and meaning. Unlike purely philosophical or scientific explanations, mythological narratives provided emotionally satisfying accounts of why things happen while establishing moral and social frameworks for human behavior. The Epic of Gilgamesh exemplifies this explanatory function, addressing fundamental questions about mortality, friendship, and the proper relationship between rulers and subjects. The narrative's exploration of Gilgamesh's transformation from tyrannical king to wise ruler provided a template for royal behavior while acknowledging the universal human struggle with mortality. But where did everything begin? How did the ancient Mesopotamians explain the very existence of the cosmos itself? The Enuma Elish stands as the most comprehensive and politically significant creation epic to survive from ancient Mesopotamia. Composed during the Old Babylonian period around 1700 BC, but reaching its canonical form during the reign of Nebuchadnezzar I in the 12th century BC, this seven-tablet epic fundamentally restructured earlier Sumerian creation traditions to serve Babylonian imperial ideology. The opening lines established the cosmic setting with stark simplicity. When on high the heaven did not yet exist, nor the earth below, Apsu, the freshwater ocean, was there, the first, the begetter, and Tiamat, she who bore them all. These primordial waters represent far more than mere mythological imagery. Apsu, the masculine freshwater ocean lying beneath the earth, embodied the life-giving properties essential for Mesopotamian agriculture. Archaeological evidence from irrigation systems dating to 3500 BC demonstrates that Mesopotamian communities understood groundwater as a distinct entity from surface water, recognizing that wells and springs tapped into a vast subterranean reservoir. This practical knowledge transformed into mythological understanding of Apsu as a conscious divine entity whose waters sustained all terrestrial life. Tiamat, the feminine saltwater ocean, represented a more complex and threatening force. Unlike Apsu's life-giving freshwater, saltwater posed constant dangers to Mesopotamian agriculture through soil salinization and destructive flooding when storm surges pushed seawater inland from the Persian Gulf. The mythological characterization of Tiamat as chaotic and destructive reflects this environmental reality, but her role as she who bore them all acknowledges that even destructive forces contain creative potential. The Enuma Elish describes how these primordial waters mingle to produce the first generation of gods. Lahmu and Lahamu, representing silt and sediment, emerge from the mixing of fresh and salt water, followed by Anshar and Kishar, embodying the circular horizons of heaven and earth. This generational progression reflects sophisticated understanding of geological processes, as Mesopotamian communities observed how river-borne sediments gradually built up the alluvial plain through countless flood cycles. The epic's central conflict emerges when the younger gods born from these primordial forces begin to disturb the ancient peace through their noise and activity. Apsu, unable to sleep due to the younger god's commotion, proposes to destroy them entirely. His vizier Mumu supports this plan, but Tiamat initially resists, arguing that destroying their offspring would be inappropriate. This generational tension reflects real social dynamics in Mesopotamian society, where established authority structures frequently clashed with innovative younger elements. The god Ea, possessing superior wisdom and magical knowledge, learns of Apsu's destructive plan and acts preemptively. Using incantations and binding spells, Ea captures Apsu and Mumu, killing Apsu and establishing his own dwelling place above the defeated freshwater ocean. Ea's victory over Apsu leads to the birth of Marduk, described as the most perfect of the gods, possessing 4 eyes and 4 ears to perceive all things, and flames emerging from his mouth when he speaks. Marduk's extraordinary attributes reflect Babylonian attempts to create a supreme deity capable of surpassing all earlier divine figures. His physical description emphasizes omniscience and the power of divine speech, qualities essential for a creator god who must establish cosmic order through verbal commands. Tiamat's response to Apsu's death drives the epic's climactic conflict. Influenced by her son Kingu and other primordial deities who resent the younger god's dominance, Tiamat finally decides to wage war against her own offspring. She creates an army of monsters, including 11 types of dragons, serpents, and hybrid creatures, each designed to inspire terror and chaos. The detailed descriptions of these monsters, the viper, dragon, sphinx, great lion, mad dog, scorpion man, howling storm, fish man, and ram, reflect Mesopotamian familiarity with both real and imagined threats from the natural world. The stage was set for the most important battle in cosmic history. The younger gods, faced with Tiamat's monstrous army, initially despair of victory. Anu, the sky god, and Ea both attempt to confront Tiamat but retreat when faced with her overwhelming power. Only Marduk volunteers to champion the younger gods, but he demands recognition as supreme king of the pantheon in exchange for his service. The gods agree to this condition after testing Marduk's power by having him make a constellation disappear and reappear through verbal command alone. This demonstration of cosmic authority through spoken words establishes the fundamental principle that would govern Mesopotamian magic for millennia. The battle between Marduk and Tiamat represents the climactic confrontation between order and chaos, with detailed descriptions emphasizing both the cosmic scale of the conflict and Marduk's tactical superiority. Marduk arms himself with bow and arrow, carries a mace, and surrounds himself with lightning. He creates winds to serve as his weapons and rides in a chariot drawn by 4 horses named Killer, Relentless, Trampler, and Swift. This military imagery reflects Mesopotamian warfare practices where chariots and composite bows represented the most advanced military technology. When Marduk confronts Tiamat directly, the epic describes their verbal exchange before combat begins. Tiamat challenges Marduk's right to rule, while Marduk accuses her of unjustly threatening her own children. This dialogue establishes the moral framework for their conflict, positioning Marduk as the defender of legitimate order against destructive chaos. The actual battle unfolds with Marduk using tactical cunning rather than mere strength, trapping Tiamat with a net and using winds to prevent her from closing her mouth, then shooting an arrow directly into her belly. The creation of the physical universe from Tiamat's corpse demonstrates Mesopotamian understanding that order emerges from the transformation of chaotic materials rather than creation from nothing. Marduk splits Tiamat's body like a shellfish, using half to create the dome of heaven and half to form the earth below. He positions guards to prevent the celestial waters from escaping and establishes the movements of celestial bodies to mark time and seasons. This cosmological structure reflects actual Mesopotamian astronomical observations, as temple records from sites like Babylon and Borsippa contain detailed observations of planetary movements dating back to the 8th century BC. The creation of humanity occurs near the epic's conclusion when Marduk decides that the gods need servants to maintain temples and perform rituals. Using the blood of Kingu, Tiamat's defeated general, mixed with clay, Ea creates human beings specifically to serve the gods. This account establishes humanity's fundamental purpose within the cosmic order while explaining human mortality through the use of a defeated god's blood rather than that of a victorious deity. The implications of this creation story would echo through Mesopotamian society for thousands of years. Alternative creation accounts from earlier periods provide different perspectives on cosmic origins while sharing fundamental themes with the Enuma Elish. The Eridu Genesis, preserved in fragmentary form on tablets from the Old Babylonian period, presents a creation narrative focused on the establishment of cities and the development of civilization. This text begins with a time when neither cities nor temples existed, and humans lived like animals without organized society. The Eridu Genesis describes how the gods decided to create humanity and establish urban civilization, with Eridu designated as the first city. Sumerian creation myths, featuring Anu and Enlil, present yet another perspective on cosmic origins, focusing on the separation of heaven and earth as the fundamental creative act. These narratives describe an original unity called the heaven-earth, which required divine intervention to separate into distinct realms. Anu, the sky god, received dominion over the upper realm, while Enlil governed the space between heaven and earth where human activity occurs. The separation myth explains several important features of Mesopotamian cosmology, including the solid dome of heaven that prevents celestial waters from flooding the earth, and the role of wind as the active force maintaining the separation between realms. But who were these gods who shaped creation? What hierarchy governed their divine society? At the apex of the divine bureaucracy stood the Anunnaki, a term derived from the Sumerian Anuna, meaning offspring of Anu, which designated the most powerful gods who determined the fates of both gods and mortals. The supreme triad that commanded ultimate authority consisted of Anu, Enlil, and Enki, each governing fundamental aspects of the cosmic order established during creation. Anu, whose name simply meant sky in Sumerian, ruled the heavenly realm from his position as the most ancient of the great gods. Archaeological evidence from Uruk, where Anu's primary temple complex stood, reveals that his worship dates to at least 3200 BC. Anu's authority derived not from active intervention in worldly affairs, but from his position as the source of divine legitimacy itself. Royal inscriptions from the third dynasty of Ur consistently invoke Anu's name when establishing divine mandates for earthly rule, with kings describing themselves as beloved of Anu or chosen by Anu to emphasize their legitimate authority. The god's distant nature reflected Mesopotamian understanding that ultimate power often manifested through delegation rather than direct action, mirroring the administrative practices of large bureaucratic states. Enlil occupied the crucial middle position in the divine triad, controlling the atmosphere, storms, and the vital space between heaven and earth, where human civilization flourished. His primary cult center at Nippur held special significance throughout Mesopotamian history, with rulers from various dynasties and regions traveling there to receive legitimation for their authority. The Ekur temple complex at Nippur, whose name meant mountain house, served as the meeting place for the divine assembly where the gods gathered to determine fates and make decisions affecting the entire cosmos. The physical description of Enlil in mythological texts emphasizes his terrifying power over natural forces. Hymns describe him as the one whose word splits mountains, whose breath creates hurricanes, and whose voice thunders across the heavens. The Epic of Gilgamesh portrays Enlil as the deity who decides to destroy humanity through the Great Flood, demonstrating his authority over life and death on a cosmic scale. Archaeological evidence from flood deposits at sites like Ur and Shuruppak dating to approximately 2900 BC suggests that memories of catastrophic flooding influenced the mythological portrayal of Enlil's destructive capabilities. Enki, the third member of the Supreme Triad, governed the freshwater ocean beneath the earth, along with wisdom, magic, and the crafts essential for civilization. His primary temple at Eridu, the Abzu Temple, was built directly over freshwater springs that the Sumerians believed connected to the cosmic freshwater ocean. Modern archaeological excavations at Eridu have confirmed the presence of these springs beneath the temple foundations, demonstrating the practical basis for mythological beliefs about Enki's aquatic domain. The characterization of Enki in mythological narratives consistently emphasizes his benevolence toward humanity and his role as the divine patron of human civilization. Unlike Enlil, whose power manifested through awesome natural forces, Enki's influence operated through intelligence, creativity, and technical knowledge. The Sumerian myth, Enki and the World Order, describes how he traveled throughout the known world, establishing the techniques of agriculture, animal husbandry, metalwork, and other essential crafts that distinguish civilized humans from wild animals. The elevation of Marduk from a relatively minor Babylonian city god to supreme ruler of the entire pantheon represents one of the most significant theological developments in Mesopotamian religious history. Originally associated with the city of Babylon and possibly derived from an early agricultural deity, Marduk's rise to prominence paralleled Babylon's political ascendancy during the Old Babylonian period. The Enuma Elish systematically restructured earlier creation narratives to place Marduk at the center of cosmic order, describing how his victory over Tiamat earned him kingship over all the gods. But the pantheon contained far more than these supreme powers. It included gods and goddesses whose passions and conflicts rivaled any human drama. Ishtar, known as Inanna in Sumerian sources, commanded a unique position within the Mesopotamian pantheon as the goddess simultaneously governing love and war, two apparently contradictory domains that reflected the complex nature of divine power. Her primary cult centers at Uruk, and later Babylon featured elaborate temple complexes where sacred prostitution, ritual combat, and elaborate festivals celebrated her dual nature. The Eanna temple complex at Uruk, dedicated to both Inanna and Anu, covered approximately 9 hectares and included multiple shrines, administrative buildings, and ceremonial courtyards that accommodated thousands of worshippers during major festivals. The mythological narratives surrounding Ishtar Inanna consistently emphasize her fierce independence and refusal to accept subordination to male authority. The famous myth, Inanna's descent to the underworld, describes how she voluntarily entered the realm of death to confront her sister Ereshkigal, demonstrating her willingness to risk everything to extend her power into previously forbidden domains. The goddess's death and resurrection in this myth provided the mythological explanation for seasonal agricultural cycles, with her absence from the upper world corresponding to the barren summer months when crops could not grow. Ishtar's association with warfare manifested in her role as patron deity of several Mesopotamian rulers who invoked her protection in military campaigns. Sargon of Akkad credited Ishtar with his victories that established the first multi-ethnic empire in human history. Assyrian kings consistently portrayed themselves as Ishtar's beloved warriors, with royal inscriptions describing how the goddess marched before Assyrian armies and struck terror into enemy hearts. The goddess's warlike attributes included her association with lions, depicted in countless artistic representations showing her standing on or accompanied by these powerful predators. Shamash, known as Utu in Sumerian, governed the sun's daily journey across the heavens while simultaneously serving as the divine judge who witnessed all human actions and ensured justice prevailed. His primary temples at Sippar and Larsa functioned not only as religious centers, but as legal institutions where judges rendered verdicts under the god's supervision. The famous Code of Hammurabi depicts Shamash presenting the laws to the Babylonian king, establishing divine sanction for human legal systems. Sin, the moon god known as Nana in Sumerian sources, commanded particular reverence as the father of both Shamash and Ishtar, establishing him as a senior deity whose phases marked the passage of time and determined the timing of religious observances. His primary cult center at Ur featured a massive ziggurat complex that dominated the city's skyline and served as the focal point for elaborate monthly festivals celebrating the new moon's appearance. The lunar calendar that governed Mesopotamian religious and administrative life depended entirely on careful observation of Sin's monthly cycle through his phases. The mother goddesses who played crucial roles in Mesopotamian mythology reflected the civilization's recognition that feminine divine power encompassed both nurturing creativity and terrifying destructive potential. Ninhursag, whose name meant Lady of the Mountain, served as the primary Earth Mother who shaped human beings from clay and oversaw childbirth, healing, and the fertility of both land and people. Her cult centers throughout Mesopotamia featured elaborate birthing chambers where women sought her assistance during labor and offered thanks for successful deliveries. The underworld deities commanded particular attention within Mesopotamian religious thought because death represented the one experience that no human could avoid, regardless of social status, wealth, or divine favor. Ereshkigal, whose name meant Queen of the Great Earth, ruled the underworld as an absolute monarch, whose authority even other gods respected and feared. Her realm, known as Irkalla or Cornugia, was conceived as a vast underground city where the dead continued to exist in a shadowy form that retained their personalities but lacked the vitality of living beings. But what of the heroes who bridged the divine and mortal realms? What stories did they tell? The Epic of Gilgamesh stands as the crown jewel of Mesopotamian literature, representing not merely the world's oldest known epic poem, but a sophisticated exploration of themes that would resonate throughout human literary tradition. The composition evolved over more than a millennium, beginning with individual Sumerian tales about Gilgamesh of Uruk dating to approximately 2100 BC, progressing through Old Babylonian versions around 1800 BC, and reaching its canonical form in the standard version compiled by the scholar-priest Sinlike-Unini around 1100 BC. Archaeological evidence from Uruk confirms that Gilgamesh ruled as an actual historical figure around 2700 BC during the early dynastic period. The Sumerian king list credits him with a reign of 126 years, obviously legendary, but indicating his lasting impact on Mesopotamian memory. Excavations at Uruk have revealed massive fortification walls dating to this period, possibly the same walls that the epic attributes to Gilgamesh's building projects. The historical Gilgamesh appears to have been a successful military leader who expanded Uruk's territory and influence. The standard version of the epic opens with a detailed description of Gilgamesh as a king whose extraordinary abilities derived from his mixed divine and human heritage. Two-thirds divine through his mother Ninsun, a minor goddess, and one-third human through his father Lugalbanda, a deified king. Gilgamesh possessed superhuman strength and intelligence while remaining subject to mortality. This hybrid nature positioned him uniquely to explore the boundaries between divine and human realms. The epic's initial portrayal of Gilgamesh presents him as a tyrannical ruler whose oppression of Uruk's citizens prompted divine intervention. The text describes how he claimed sexual rights over all brides on their wedding nights and conscripted young men for endless building projects, behaviors that violated the reciprocal obligations between rulers and subjects that formed the foundation of Mesopotamian political theory. The citizens' prayers to the gods for relief established the narrative framework for divine response to human suffering. The creation of Enkidu as Gilgamesh's eventual companion and moral equal represents one of literature's most sophisticated character development devices. The goddess Aruru fashioned Enkidu from clay in the wilderness, creating a being who embodied natural humanity before civilization's corrupting influences. The epic's description of Enkidu emphasizes his complete integration with the natural world. His body covered with hair like a wild animal, his strength sufficient to protect herds from predators, his diet consisting entirely of grass and water shared with gazelles. The process of Enkidu's civilization through encounter with the harlot Shamhat explores fundamental questions about the relationship between nature and culture that concerned Mesopotamian thinkers. Shamhat's seduction of Enkidu over 6 days and 7 nights represents more than mere sexual initiation. It symbolizes the transformation from natural to cultural existence that all humans must undergo. After their encounter, wild animals flee from Enkidu, recognizing that he no longer belongs to their realm, while his acquisition of human consciousness enables him to understand speech and social customs. The friendship that develops between Gilgamesh and Enkidu after their initial combat provides the epic's emotional and thematic center. Their fight, occurring when Enkidu blocks Gilgamesh's path to claim another bride, demonstrates that both heroes possess comparable strength and courage. The combat's resolution through mutual recognition of each other's worth establishes a bond based on equality rather than dominance, offering a model for relationships that transcend conventional social hierarchies. Together, they would undertake adventures that would challenge the very gods themselves. The adventures that Gilgamesh and Enkidu undertake together explore themes of heroic achievement and divine displeasure that recur throughout Mesopotamian literature. Their expedition to the cedar forest to kill the monster Humbaba represents humanity's ongoing struggle to expand civilized territory at the expense of wild nature. Humbaba, appointed by Enlil as guardian of the cedar forest, embodies the divine protection extended to natural places that humans coveted for their resources. The monster's terrifying appearance, with a face like intestines, breath like fire, and a roar like floodwaters, symbolizes the natural forces that resisted human expansion. The detailed descriptions of the heroes' preparations for their journey demonstrate Mesopotamian understanding of the practical requirements for dangerous expeditions. They commission special weapons from skilled craftsmen, seek divine protection through prayers and offerings, and gather intelligence about their destination from travelers and merchants. Gilgamesh's consultation with the elders of Uruk reflects the political processes through which Mesopotamian rulers sought approval for risky ventures that could affect entire communities. The actual battle with Humbaba reveals both the heroes' courage and their dependence on divine assistance. Shamash, the sun god, aids them by creating 13 winds that blind and confuse the monster, demonstrating that even the mightiest heroes require divine favor to accomplish extraordinary feats. Humbaba's pleas for mercy and offers to serve Gilgamesh as a faithful servant introduce moral complexity into what initially appeared to be a straightforward combat between good and evil. Enkidu's insistence that they must kill the monster despite his surrender reflects the harsh practical considerations that governed heroic action. The consequences of Humbaba's death establish the pattern of divine retribution that drives the epic's tragic conclusion. Enlil's anger at the destruction of his appointed guardian results in a decree that one of the two heroes must die as punishment for their presumption. This divine response illustrates the Mesopotamian belief that even justified actions could provoke divine displeasure if they disrupted cosmic order or challenged divine prerogatives. The heroes' second great adventure, their killing of the bull of heaven sent by Ishtar to punish Gilgamesh for rejecting her sexual advances, further develops themes of heroic achievement and divine conflict. Ishtar's proposal of marriage to Gilgamesh represents the goddess's attempt to incorporate the hero into the divine realm through sacred marriage, a practice that historically occurred between Mesopotamian rulers and priestesses representing various goddesses. Gilgamesh's rejection, accompanied by a detailed recital of Ishtar's previous lover's fates, demonstrates his awareness that divine favor could quickly transform into divine wrath. The bull of heaven's rampage through Uruk, killing hundreds of young men with each snort, represents divine power unleashed against human civilization. The epic's description of the bull's massive size, with hooves that created pits large enough to trap hundreds of men, emphasizes the overwhelming force that gods could deploy against mortals who defied their will. The successful cooperation between Gilgamesh and Enkidu in killing the bull demonstrates that human friendship and mutual support could overcome even divine opposition when properly coordinated. Enkidu's death, decreed by the divine assembly as punishment for the hero's presumptuous actions, transforms the epic from adventure narrative to profound meditation on mortality and loss. The detailed description of Enkidu's gradual decline through illness lasting 12 days allows for extensive exploration of both heroes' responses to impending separation. Enkidu's curses directed against those who civilized him reveal his recognition that culture, while providing benefits, also created vulnerabilities unknown to natural existence. The greatest quest was about to begin, a quest that would take Gilgamesh beyond the edge of the world itself. Gilgamesh's reaction to Enkidu's death demonstrates the epic's sophisticated psychological insight into grief and denial. His refusal to allow burial until worms emerge from Enkidu's nose reflects his inability to accept the finality of death, while his adoption of animal skins and wilderness wandering represents his rejection of the civilized life that failed to protect his friend. The epic's description of Gilgamesh's mourning, including his composition of formal laments and his distribution of precious goods to honor Enkidu's memory, illustrates Mesopotamian funeral practices while emphasizing the depth of his loss. The quest for immortality that occupies the epic's final sections explores humanity's ultimate limitation and the boundaries that separate mortal from divine existence. Gilgamesh's journey to find Utnapishtim, the survivor of the Great Flood, takes him beyond the edges of the known world into realms where normal humans could not survive. His passage through the Tunnel of the Sun, guarded by scorpion men whose appearance alone could kill ordinary mortals, demonstrates his extraordinary nature while emphasizing the dangers faced by those who sought to transcend human limitations. The encounter with Siduri, the divine tavern keeper who counsels Gilgamesh to abandon his quest and enjoy mortal pleasures, presents alternative approaches to confronting mortality. Her advice to eat, drink, celebrate festivals, and cherish family relationships reflects mainstream Mesopotamian wisdom about finding meaning within mortal existence rather than seeking to escape it. Gilgamesh's rejection of this counsel demonstrates his heroic refusal to accept conventional limitations while also illustrating the isolation that such refusal created. Utnapishtim's account of the Great Flood, paralleling but predating the biblical narrative, provides crucial context for understanding divine attitudes toward humanity and the exceptional circumstances that could grant immortality to mortals. His survival resulted not from personal merit, but from Enki's warning and specific instructions for building an ark, emphasizing divine favor rather than human achievement as the source of his eternal life. The flood narrative itself demonstrates the god's capacity for both destructive wrath and protective mercy, as Enlil's decision to destroy humanity was balanced by other gods' efforts to preserve life. The plant of rejuvenation that Utnapishtim reveals to Gilgamesh represents humanity's closest approach to conquering mortality through natural means. Located at the bottom of the freshwater ocean, accessible only through dangerous diving that required supernatural endurance, the plant offered renewal rather than true immortality. Gilgamesh's successful retrieval of the plant demonstrates his heroic capabilities, while its subsequent theft by a serpent while he bathed illustrates the impossibility of permanently overcoming mortal limitations. The epic's conclusion, with Gilgamesh's return to Uruk and his recognition of the city's walls as his true monument, provides resolution through acceptance rather than achievement. His transformation from tyrannical king to wise ruler, accomplished through suffering and loss rather than victory, offers a model for personal growth that acknowledges both human potential and human limitations. The emphasis on his building achievements and just governance suggests that mortals could achieve a form of immortality through lasting contributions to civilization. Beyond the Epic of Gilgamesh, other heroic narratives explore different aspects of the relationship between mortals and gods, while addressing concerns specific to Mesopotamian culture and society. The adventures of Etana, preserved in fragmentary form from various periods, focused on the theme of divine assistance in achieving legitimate goals that served communal rather than personal interests. Etana, described as a shepherd who became king, sought the plant of birth to enable his wife to conceive an heir, addressing the crucial concern of dynastic succession that preoccupied Mesopotamian rulers. But while heroes could strive for greatness, one fate awaited all mortals, a journey to the dark realm beneath the earth. The underworld, known by various names including Irkalla and Kurnugia, represented not merely a destination for the deceased, but a parallel kingdom with its own complex geography, administrative structure, and divine hierarchy that mirrored and inverted the world of the living. This shadowy realm, conceived as lying beneath the Earth's surface, yet extending infinitely downward, functioned as the ultimate equalizer where divine favor, royal status, and material wealth became meaningless in the face of death's absolute authority. The physical landscape of the underworld, as described in numerous Mesopotamian texts, consisted of a vast underground city surrounded by 7 concentric walls, each pierced by a single gate, guarded by fearsome gatekeepers who served Ereshkigal's will. The outermost wall, constructed from gleaming obsidian that reflected no light, marked the boundary between the world of the living and the realm of the dead. Travelers approaching this barrier encountered Neti, the chief gatekeeper, whose appearance combined human intelligence with demonic features, including glowing red eyes, bronze claws, and a voice that echoed like wind through empty chambers. The journey through each successive gate required the surrender of items that connected the deceased to their former life, beginning with weapons and tools that had defined their earthly occupations, and progressing through clothing, jewelry, and finally the breath itself that animated mortal flesh. The gatekeepers at each threshold possessed specific knowledge about the approaching soul's earthly deeds, questioning them about their religious observances, their treatment of family members, and their fulfillment of social obligations. The innermost regions of Irkalla contained Ereshkigal's palace, a massive structure built from black stone quarried from the foundations of the earth itself. The palace's architecture deliberately inverted the design principles of temples in the upper world, with corridors that narrowed rather than expanded as they approached the throne room, ceilings that pressed downward rather than soaring toward heaven, and windows that looked inward upon eternal darkness rather than outward toward light. Ereshkigal's appearance in mythological descriptions emphasized her absolute authority over death and her complete separation from the life-giving forces that govern the upper world. Her skin possessed the pale blue-white color of corpses, while her hair, black as the space between stars, flowed like liquid shadow around shoulders, draped in robes woven from the silence of tombs. Her crown, fashioned from the bones of primordial creatures that had died before the creation of the current world, marked her as ruler over not merely human death, but the dissolution that claimed all things. The vast population of the underworld consisted primarily of the Atemu, the shades of deceased humans who retained their personalities and memories but existed in a weakened state that prevented them from influencing events in the world of the living. These spirits, described as being as insubstantial as smoke, yet retaining human appearance, wandered through the underworld's districts according to their social status and the manner of their death. Warriors who had died in battle occupied quarters near the palace where they could serve Ereshkigal's guard. The condition of the Atemu depended heavily on the funeral rites performed by their living relatives and the ongoing offerings provided to sustain them in their shadowy existence. Properly buried dead who received regular libations of water and offerings of bread could maintain a relatively comfortable existence within the underworld's hierarchy, retaining their human appearance and some degree of mobility within their assigned districts. Those who died without proper burial or whose families failed to provide ongoing sustenance gradually deteriorated into increasingly pathetic states. The elaborate funeral practices that developed throughout Mesopotamian civilization reflected deep understanding of the connection between proper burial procedures and the deceased's condition in the underworld. But even as Mesopotamians contemplated death, they also sought wisdom to guide them through life, wisdom that came from the God who loved humanity most. Enki's role as patron of crafts and technical knowledge manifested through his association with skilled artisans who created the luxury goods that marked elite status and religious devotion. The gods' workshops in the Abzu were described as containing every tool and material necessary for the highest levels of craftsmanship, including precious metals, rare stones, and exotic woods imported from distant lands. The divine craftsmen who served Enki possessed supernatural skill that enabled them to create objects of perfect beauty and functionality, establishing standards that mortal artisans strove to emulate through careful training and religious observance. The magical aspects of Enki's wisdom encompassed the knowledge of incantations, protective spells, and ritual procedures that enabled humans to influence supernatural forces and communicate with divine beings. The Mesopotamian magical tradition consistently portrayed Enki as the ultimate source of effective magical knowledge, with professional magicians invoking his name and authority when performing complex rituals designed to heal diseases, protect communities from demonic attack, or divine future events through various forms of supernatural consultation. The story of Adapa, preserved in multiple versions from various periods, illustrates the complex relationship between divine wisdom and human limitation that characterized Mesopotamian theological thought. Adapa, described as the wisest of mortals and a priest of Enki in the ancient city of Eridu, possessed supernatural knowledge that distinguished him from ordinary humans while still leaving him subject to mortality and the consequences of incomplete understanding. The narrative begins with Adapa's daily activities as a fisherman and priest, combining practical work that sustained his community with religious duties that maintained proper relationships with divine powers. The crisis that drove the narrative occurred when Adapa accidentally broke the wing of the south wind during a fishing expedition, causing the wind to cease blowing for 7 days and disrupting weather patterns throughout the region. The south wind's personification as a divine being whose injury constituted an assault on cosmic order transformed Adapa's accident into a serious theological problem that required resolution through divine judgment. Anu's summons requiring Adapa to appear in heaven for judgment created unprecedented circumstances, as mortals typically could not survive in the divine realm without special protection. The tragic irony of Adapa's refusal of immortality, based on Enki's well-intentioned but ultimately incorrect advice, demonstrates the limitations inherent in even divine knowledge when applied to unprecedented situations. Enki's assumption that Anu would offer poisoned food to destroy a presumptuous mortal reflected reasonable caution based on typical divine behavior, but failed to account for the supreme god's genuine admiration for Adapa's character and abilities. The miscommunication between divine beings resulted in humanity's permanent exclusion from immortality, establishing the fundamental limitation that would define mortal existence throughout subsequent history. The development of divination as a systematic means of accessing divine knowledge represents one of Mesopotamian civilization's most sophisticated intellectual achievements. The assumption that gods communicated their intentions through observable signs in the natural world led to elaborate systems for interpreting omens that could guide human decision-making in matters ranging from personal relationships to military campaigns. The professional diviners who specialized in these interpretive techniques occupied crucial positions within Mesopotamian society, serving as advisors to rulers and intermediaries between divine will and human planning. Hepatoscopy, the examination of sheep livers for divinatory purposes, developed into the most prestigious and technically complex form of Mesopotamian divination. The procedure required the sacrifice of a specially selected sheep under precisely controlled conditions, followed by careful examination of the liver's surface features, internal structure, and color variations. Professional hepatoscopists trained for years to master the complex classification systems that correlated specific liver characteristics with particular types of future events. The astronomical observations that formed the basis for Mesopotamian astrology represented another sophisticated approach to divining divine will through careful study of celestial phenomena. The movement of planets, the appearance of comets, and the occurrence of eclipses were all interpreted as divine communications that could provide guidance about earthly affairs. The temple astronomers who maintained these observation programs created detailed records spanning centuries, enabling them to predict celestial events and correlate them with historical patterns of political and social change. But how did these ancient traditions spread beyond Mesopotamia's borders? The Akkadian conquest under Sargon of Akkad initiated the first major phase of mythological adaptation as the Semitic-speaking Akkadians encountered the sophisticated religious traditions of the non-Semitic Sumerians. Rather than attempting wholesale replacement of existing beliefs, the Akkadian administrators and priests pursued a deliberate policy of syncretism that identified their own deities with Sumerian counterparts while preserving the narrative structures that had already proven effective in legitimizing divine authority and explaining natural phenomena. The linguistic transformation of divine names during this period reveals the systematic nature of Akkadian adaptation efforts. The Sumerian sky god An became Anu in Akkadian sources, maintaining phonetic similarity while conforming to Akkadian grammatical structures. Enlil retained his Sumerian name, but acquired additional epithets and attributes drawn from Akkadian storm deities, creating a composite figure whose mythology incorporated elements from both traditions. The goddess Inanna underwent more complex transformation into Ishtar, as the Akkadian version absorbed characteristics from multiple Semitic goddesses. The Old Babylonian period, beginning around 1894 BC with the establishment of the Amorite dynasty, witnessed the most significant transformation of Mesopotamian mythology as Babylon emerged as the dominant political and cultural center. The elevation of Marduk from a relatively minor local deity to supreme god of the pantheon exemplified the systematic restructuring of mythological traditions to serve new political needs. This process required not merely the promotion of a single deity, but the comprehensive reorganization of cosmic relationships that had been established in earlier mythological systems. The theological sophistication of the Enuma Elish demonstrates how mythological adaptation could serve multiple functions simultaneously. The epic provided religious justification for Babylonian political supremacy while also addressing genuine theological questions about the nature of divine authority and cosmic order. The detailed description of Marduk's qualifications for supreme kingship, including his superior wisdom, magical power, and military prowess, established criteria for divine leadership that could be applied to earthly rulers seeking to legitimize their authority through divine analogy. The Assyrian adaptation of Babylonian mythological traditions, beginning around 1365 BC as Assyria emerged as a major imperial power, illustrates how established mythological systems could be further modified to serve different political and cultural needs. The Assyrians inherited the Marduk-centered cosmology, but faced the challenge of promoting their own national deity, Ashur, without completely disrupting the theological framework that had become standard throughout Mesopotamia. Their solution involved elevating Ashur to supreme status while maintaining Marduk's cosmic functions. The development of standardized mythological texts during the Neo-Assyrian period reflects the systematic approach that Assyrian administrators applied to cultural control and preservation. The library assembled by Ashurbanipal at Nineveh between 668 and 627 BC represents the most comprehensive effort in ancient history to collect, standardize, and preserve literary and religious traditions from throughout Mesopotamia. The king's scribes traveled to temples and libraries across the empire, copying texts and creating standardized versions that would serve as authoritative sources for future generations. The influence of Mesopotamian mythological traditions on neighboring cultures provides compelling evidence for the systematic transmission of religious concepts across linguistic and ethnic boundaries. The Hittite Empire, centered in Anatolia and reaching its peak between 1650 and 1200 BC, absorbed numerous Mesopotamian mythological narratives while adapting them to serve Hittite political and religious needs. The Hittite versions of Mesopotamian myths demonstrate how established narratives could be modified to incorporate local deities and cultural values while preserving essential theological concepts. But the greatest influence of all would be on the traditions that shaped the Western world. The influence of Mesopotamian mythology on early Hebrew traditions represents perhaps the most historically significant example of cultural transmission, as Hebrew adaptations of Mesopotamian narratives would eventually influence the development of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. The Hebrew flood narrative preserved in Genesis clearly derives from Mesopotamian prototypes, particularly the Atrahasis epic and the flood account in the Epic of Gilgamesh. But the Hebrew version transforms these sources to serve distinctly monotheistic theological purposes. The biblical creation account in Genesis demonstrates the most direct and extensively documented influence of Mesopotamian mythological traditions on later religious literature. The Hebrew narrative preserves the fundamental sequence of cosmic development described in the Enuma Elish, beginning with primordial waters, proceeding through the separation of celestial and terrestrial realms, and concluding with the creation of humanity to serve divine purposes. However, the biblical account systematically eliminates the polytheistic framework that characterized its Mesopotamian sources. The linguistic parallels between Genesis and Mesopotamian creation texts extend beyond general narrative structure to include specific terminology and imagery that demonstrates direct textual influence. The Hebrew word tehom, translated as the deep in Genesis 1:2, derives directly from the Akkadian Tiamat, the primordial chaos goddess whose defeat by Marduk enabled the creation of ordered cosmos. The preservation of this linguistic connection reveals how Hebrew authors consciously adapted Mesopotamian source material while transforming its theological implications. The biblical flood narrative provides even more extensive evidence of Mesopotamian influence, with detailed parallels extending from general plot structure to specific technical details about ark construction and divine motivation for universal destruction. The Genesis account preserves the basic framework of the Atrahasis epic, including divine displeasure with human behavior, the selection of a righteous individual for preservation, detailed instructions for building a survival vessel, the gathering of animals, and the gradual recession of floodwaters, followed by divine covenant establishment. The technical specifications for Noah's Ark correspond closely to those provided for Atrahasis's vessel in Mesopotamian sources, including the use of bitumen for waterproofing, the construction of multiple decks for different categories of passengers, and the specific dimensions that would provide adequate space for extended survival during universal inundation. The biblical account's preservation of these practical details demonstrates how Hebrew authors inherited not merely general narrative themes, but specific technical knowledge that had been developed through centuries of Mesopotamian literary tradition. The Hebrew wisdom literature preserved in books like Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Job demonstrates extensive influence from Mesopotamian intellectual traditions while adapting these sources to serve monotheistic theological frameworks. The biblical book of Proverbs includes numerous sayings that correspond closely to those found in Mesopotamian wisdom collections, particularly the instructions of Shuruppak and similar texts that provided moral guidance for educated elites. However, the biblical versions systematically attribute all wisdom to divine revelation rather than human observation and experience. The book of Ecclesiastes presents perhaps the most complex example of Mesopotamian influence on Hebrew wisdom literature, as its exploration of life's meaninglessness and the inevitability of death clearly reflects themes that originated in the Epic of Gilgamesh and related Mesopotamian meditations on mortality. The famous passage declaring that there is nothing new under the sun echoes Mesopotamian philosophical traditions that emphasize the cyclical nature of human experience and the futility of seeking permanent achievement in a world governed by divine caprice and natural limitation. The archaeological rediscovery of Mesopotamian civilization beginning in the 19th century revolutionized understanding of ancient Near Eastern culture and revealed the sophisticated intellectual achievements of humanity's earliest urban civilizations. The excavations conducted by pioneers like Paul-Emile Botta at Khorsabad, Austin Henry Layard at Nimrud and Nineveh, and later scholars throughout Mesopotamia uncovered vast libraries of cuneiform tablets that preserved mythological traditions spanning over 3 millennia of continuous literary development. The ancient voices still speak to us today, and their message remains as powerful as ever. The decipherment of cuneiform writing by scholars like Georg Friedrich Grotefend, Henry Rawlinson, and their successors enabled systematic study of Mesopotamian literature and revealed the complexity and sophistication of ancient mythological thinking. The discovery that cuneiform texts included not merely administrative records, but extensive literary works, scientific observations, and religious treatises demonstrated that Mesopotamian civilization had achieved intellectual sophistication that rivaled any subsequent culture in its systematic approach to understanding cosmic order and human purpose. The publication of cuneiform texts beginning in the late 19th century made Mesopotamian mythology accessible to international scholarly communities and revealed the profound influence that these ancient traditions had exerted on later religious and literary development. The recognition that biblical narratives had clear Mesopotamian antecedents sparked extensive scholarly debate about the nature of religious authority and the historical development of monotheistic traditions, while also demonstrating the remarkable continuity of human mythological thinking across cultural and temporal boundaries. The discovery of multiple versions of the same mythological narratives, preserved in libraries throughout Mesopotamia, enabled scholars to trace the evolution of mythological traditions and understand how ancient communities adapted inherited stories to serve changing political and religious needs. The comparison of different versions of the Gilgamesh epic, for example, revealed how the narrative had evolved from individual Sumerian tales into a sophisticated literary work that addressed universal themes of friendship, mortality, and the search for meaning in human existence. The systematic cataloging of cuneiform tablets in modern museum collections has created research resources that enable comprehensive study of Mesopotamian mythology and its influence on subsequent cultural development. The digitization of tablet collections and the development of online databases have made these ancient texts accessible to scholars worldwide, facilitating collaborative research projects that continue to reveal new insights into the complexity and sophistication of Mesopotamian religious thought. The contemporary relevance of Mesopotamian mythological themes has been recognized by scholars in fields ranging from comparative literature to analytical psychology who have identified archetypal patterns in these ancient narratives that continue to resonate with modern audiences. Carl Jung's analysis of mythological symbols and their psychological significance drew extensively on Mesopotamian sources, particularly the exploration of heroic journeys and encounters with death that characterize narratives like the Epic of Gilgamesh. Modern literary analysis of Mesopotamian mythology has revealed sophisticated narrative techniques and thematic development that anticipate later developments in world literature. The use of parallel episodes, symbolic imagery, and psychological character development in works like the Epic of Gilgamesh demonstrates that ancient authors possessed literary skills that rival those of any subsequent period. The recognition of these artistic achievements has led to increased appreciation for Mesopotamian literature as foundational to human literary tradition rather than merely primitive precursor to later developments. The influence of Mesopotamian mythology on modern literature extends from direct adaptations of ancient narratives to the incorporation of mythological themes and symbols in contemporary works. Authors like Jorge Luis Borges, Italo Calvino and numerous others have drawn inspiration from Mesopotamian sources, creating modern works that explore ancient themes while addressing contemporary concerns. The enduring appeal of these mythological narratives demonstrates their continued relevance for understanding fundamental aspects of human experience. The legacy of Mesopotamian mythology extends far beyond its historical significance to encompass ongoing influence on human thought, literature, and religious understanding that continues to shape contemporary culture in ways both obvious and subtle. From the biblical narratives that billions of people regard as sacred scripture, to the archetypal patterns that psychologists recognize in human behavior, the intellectual achievements of ancient Mesopotamian civilization continue to influence human understanding of cosmic order, divine purpose, and the meaning of mortal existence. Subscribe to explore more ancient civilizations that shaped our modern world. This is the eternal flow of history.